These people are the lucky ones. It's 9:30 in the morning on the Italian island of Lampedusa, about 80 miles from the coast of Tunisia in North Africa. Sometime in the last few weeks, these migrants made the dangerous crossing to Europe in a small boat and were picked up by the Italian authorities. They're mostly young men, a few women and children. Many of them are clearly exhausted after their journey, but all seem to be happy to be here. After some initial checks on Lampedusa, this ferry is now taking them further into Europe, where decisions will be made about whether they can stay. Where are you from? Syria? 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 Syria. All right. Have a nice trip. Syria? Bangladesh? Bangladesh? Bangladesh. Syria. Syria boys. It is extraordinary just to be standing here to watch hundreds of people desperately hoping for a new life in Europe. So many different stories coming from so many different countries. One thing unites them is hope. Hope for better times, better chances, jobs in another place called Europe. The thing is, there are huge amounts of people in Europe, particularly on the far right, who simply do not want this. They do not want them on this continent. And their arrival, the far right would say, poses an enormous threat to our way of life.
Thousands of migrants allowed to enter without permission, who end up crowding out the slums of our towns and cities, undercutting the salaries of our own workers, and in many instances engaging in crime. Will we surrender in front of this? No, we won't.
That's a message that helped propel Giorgia Meloni into power in Italy in 2022 at the head of its most radical right-wing government in 80 years, and topped the poll there in the recent European Union Parliament elections. It was the kind of message that helped Germany's far-right AfD also make significant gains in that European election. And the same in France, where National Rally beat every other French party in that vote. A result that spurred President Macron to call a national election, gambling that French voters wouldn't want the far right actually running their country for the first time since the Second World War.
Merci infiniment à toutes celles et ceux qui partout dans le pays, n'écoutant aucun des pronostics.
They didn't. It was left-wingers from the hastily assembled Popular Front Alliance who celebrated pushing National Rally into third place. We'll return to that French election and National Rally's ambitions later. But why is the far right on the rise? We're on a journey across Europe to find out, starting at its southern border. It's a regular sight in Lampedusa, migrants picked up by the Italian Coast Guard somewhere between here and the Libyan or Tunisian coast, brought into the island's tiny harbour. It's their first contact with European soil, and it triggers a well-practiced operation. Well, these migrants we're seeing now have been picked up from out at sea. We don't know the circumstances in which they were rescued, but presumably they were in a small boat. They've been picked up by the Italians and taken here, and as they get off each vessel, You hear the numbers being counted, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so they know how many passengers are getting off. Of course, you don't hear any names. From here, they're being taken into buses, and from the buses, they're driven up to the processing centre on Lampedusa. Here, there are people from the Red Cross, there's an ambulance, there are doctors and nurses, of course the police are here, but also a nun welcoming them to the island. We followed the buses on the 5-minute drive to what's known as the hotspot. Well, this is the end of at least this journey. This is the processing centre where those migrants came in on the boat and they're taken by bus. We're not allowed to go any further, but in here they'll have more medical checks, they'll have paperwork, at least the start of the paperwork trail, and they will hope that they haven't moved from one nightmare in the countries they've left into another, certainly a bureaucratic one. Many people who try to reach Europe have to be plucked from the sea when their boat capsizes or sinks. The Italian Coast Guard says this incident is one of 3 which claimed the lives of 20 people in 24 hours in April 2023. In total, more than 3,000 people died crossing the Mediterranean that year, many hundreds more so far in 2024. We found this boat washed up on the rocks on Lampedusa. Most migrants make the crossing in terrible conditions on dangerous seas in overcrowded wooden or inflatable boats.
If just one of the tube of the rubber boat starts leaking, then it deflates, and then you find yourself in the water basically because the rubber boat deflates and you're there. And the other risk is the bottom of the rubber boat breaking up and all the people finishing into the water.
The lucky ones are picked up by the authorities or search and rescue charities. Luca, what do you think is the story with the boat? What happened here? Do we know?
Yeah, basically this boat was assisted 2 days ago by one of our patrol boats, the Aurora, which is one of the boats of Sea-Watch, which is the organization that does search and rescue at sea. This boat was spotted by one of our aircraft, Seaboard, 2 days ago. It had around 30 people on board.
There were 30 people on board this boat?
Yeah, exactly. So you can imagine 30 people on this small boat. It's clearly a distress case. So that's why when we spotted the boat, we immediately alerted the authorities because it's a distress case at sea and needs to be rescued as soon as possible. Then in the area, there was also our ship, Aurora, which was there to assist eventually boats in distress that were there. So we also contacted Aurora that arrived on scene. We distributed life jackets to the people that were on board because you have to imagine that people on that boat didn't have life jacket, they didn't have food, they didn't have water. So as soon as we arrived on scene, we distributed these to the people on board, and then we waited with them until the Italian Coast Guard arrived and rescued the people and brought them here to Lampedusa to disembark.
The migrant boats are nearly all the same flimsy design manufactured in bulk for the people smugglers in North Africa. We don't know the fate of the people in this one in a scrapyard on Lampedusa. The fate of many who perish on the crossing is also unknown, their bodies never recovered. But in the island's cemetery, we found a few who'd been given a final resting place. This is the grave of someone called Esther Ada, and she was born in Nigeria, and she was 18 years old. There's no name on this grave, but it says the remains of a 20-year-old man lie here, and he was amongst a ship of 53 migrants, and it's thought that he came from sub-Saharan Africa. This is the grave of someone called Ezekiel, who was born in Nigeria, who died trying to get to Europe, 36 years old. The Coast Guard rescued this ship just off the coast of Libya, and there were 271 passengers on board. 36 of them were women and 21 children. 25 of those passengers died of asphyxiation below deck, and 6 of them are buried here. For thousands of people who do make it, this is the gateway to Europe. They're drawn here by the prospect of work, filling big gaps in the continent's labour markets. They're just a small fraction compared to the millions who arrive every year by authorised routes with visas. But it's images like these that far-right parties have seized on across the continent to claim European Christian civilization is being swamped.
E buonasera, buonasera a tutti e a tutte. Il tempo sembra fermarsi, ma adesso vado dalla mia regina a raccontare tutto quello che i miei occhi hanno visto e le mie orecchie hanno udito.
But there are people in Lampedusa who reject how the far right frames the migration issue as a threat to European Christian culture.
Ma non è così, perché fra i migranti ci sono anche molti cristiani, cristiani copti, cristiani... Non è così. Ci sono musulmani, ci sono cristiani, ma credo non sia quello il problema. Il problema è, dovremmo chiederci perché le persone lasciano il proprio paese, quali sono le cause che spingono centinaia di migliaia di persone a lasciare il proprio paese e perché non possono viaggiare in maniera regolare, pagando un biglietto e andando dove vogliono.
But those more welcoming voices are not making policy. NGOs, charities and other critics say deals the EU has done with North African countries mean it's outsourced its migration policy, effectively paying them to stop people reaching Europe. The result, they say, scenes like these.
You are endangering the people.
Sea-Watch accuses the Libyan Coast Guard of firing towards migrants in boats.
They're shooting again. So-called Libyan Coast Guard, stop shooting in the water. So-called Libyan Coast Guard, what you do is very dangerous. Over.
Forcing people out and setting fire to their vessel in another instance. Life-saving is everyone's responsibility, according to the European Commission. But its migration commissioner accuses the Libyan Coast Guard of being infiltrated by criminals. Sea-Watch says this shows the Libyan Coast Guard using a boat supplied by Italy and identical to its own Coast Guard vessels to interfere with the rescue operation by the charity Doctors Without Borders.
What are they doing?
Previous Italian governments have made things harder for NGOs. But Sea-Watch says the current one is turning the screws.
So what they are trying to do is to slow down the operation of NGOs, also, for example, by assigning place of safety to disembark the people that were rescued at sea farther northern of Italy, so up to Genova, to Ravenna. That means that once the vessel NGO is rescuing a boat at sea, then they have to navigate for 4 days to arrive at the port where they can disembark, while usually in the past it was, and according to international law, the port that is being assigned has to be the closest cheapest one, and usually it was ports in Sicily that were possible to reach in like one day. So what they are trying to do is to slow down NGOs' work, to keep them away from the area of operation.
Libyan Coast Guard, Libyan Coast Guard, we are observing your reckless operation. We are observing your reckless operation. There's a close rescue asset, Humanity One, which was already in the rescue of those people. You are interfering in this rescue. Now there are people in the water. There are many people in the water because of your reckless operation. Please head back from the scene. Please head back from the scene. Over.
This sculpture symbolizes Lampedusa's role as the door to Europe. To explain why the far right is so determined to slam the real door shut and why that's delivering them electoral success, we need to head north, further into the heart of Europe. All roads, it used to be said, lead to Rome. Italy's capital draws millions of tourists every year, fascinated by the ancient remains of the Roman Empire, dating back over 2,000 years. Rome was also the center of attention in 2022, when Giorgia Meloni became Prime Minister at the head of a coalition between her right-wing Brothers of Italy party and the even more radical Salvini League. Still in power, it's Italy's most right-wing government since the end of the Second World War, nearly 80 years ago.
Benito Mussolini, loudly threatening war unless France handed over to Italy whole chunks of her rich North African empire.
You can still feel the presence of the man who took Italy into that war, the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. This is the balcony where he addressed the crowds in the center of Rome. Some feared Meloni's election meant Italy was reviving that extreme right-wing past because of the neo-fascist roots of her own party. She was at pains to reject that shortly before she became Prime Minister.
The Italian right has handed fascism over history for decades now, unambiguously condemning the suppression of democracy and the ignominious anti-Jewish laws.
We'll look at whether fascism is just history, why the migration issue is boosting support for the far right across Europe, how far-right parties are making promises on immigration they probably can't deliver, and what the rise of nationalist populist parties means for the future of the EU. Within a year of being elected on a promise to cut immigration, Giorgia Meloni visited Lampedusa with the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and promised to take tougher measures.
Noi porteremo la norma per estendere al massimo consentito dalle regole europee il trattenimento ai fini del rimpatrio di chi arriva irregolarmente in Italia e daremo mandato al Ministero della Difesa di attivarsi immediatamente per realizzare le strutture che sono necessarie.
It's the kind of tough message that has won her party's support, even in regions a long way from where the boats land. This is L'Aquila, the capital city of the Abruzzo. This beautiful region across the mountains east of Rome is where Giorgia Meloni's party got some of its earliest electoral successes before taking power nationally and boosting the confidence of the far right across Europe.
Grazie.
It's also an area with a tragic history of natural disaster.
Think of Italy, and maybe somewhere like this comes to mind. A sun-kissed piazza enjoying a coffee, but they're also rebuilding here after the devastating earthquake back in 2009, which claimed the lives of over 300 people. As you can probably hear, they're flat out trying to reconstruct the center. But this is also perhaps the epicenter of a political earthquake that's rumbling here and far, far beyond.
The mayor of this city, from the Brothers of Italy party, says its role in starting that political earthquake is down to paying attention to local issues. But the question of immigration is never far away.
L'Aquila è stato il primo capoluogo di regione in cui un esponente di Fratelli d'Italia è diventato sindaco, così come l'Abruzzo è stata la prima regione in cui un esponente di Fratelli d'Italia è diventato governatore. Io credo che il successo della nostra proposta elettorale qui in città dipenda dalla percezione che l'amministrazione attuale è immersa nei problemi della città. E i problemi della città, sul tema delle migrazioni per esempio, sono duplici, nel senso che noi siamo attenti alle esigenze naturalmente dei cittadini che non sono italiani, esattamente come siamo attenti alle esigenze dei cittadini italiani, così come non nascondiamo che l'immigrazione incontrollata crea delle tensioni ed è accaduto anche in questa città con i minori non accompagnati che si sono resi responsabili di reati legati soprattutto allo spaccio e a reati contro la persona e anche diciamo da comportamenti che hanno minato un po' la convivenza pacifica con delle forme di inciviltà.
But perhaps it's not surprising that a regional area like the Abruzzo has shifted so radically to the right. It may reflect not just a European, but a global trend. The political historian Giovanni Orsina puts it like this.
People think they've been betrayed and they are angry about this. And if you look at how the voters are behaving across the Western world, you see that there is now a very deep divide between the big cities, above all the center areas of the big cities, and the rural areas. People who live in small centers, in rural areas, that feel cut off the global world, and people who live in the big cities that are like the knots of the global network, the crossing points of the global networks. You see this essentially everywhere. So it is quite clear that this backlash, this political anger, is related to the fact that you think that your local communitarian way of life is threatened by globalization, or the other option, you feel that globalization is good for you because you live in one of the elements of the global network. And it is quite clear that this is the division now, and it is quite clear that the local elites of the periphery are angry at the global elites of the centers.
That anger has many sources. The cost of living crisis, climate policy, even issues like gender. But the arrival of thousands of migrants is near the top of the list.